Hola, hello, hi everyone. Good afternoon, good morning everyone, and welcome to the first event of the Uncommon Thread series, Co-Creating Societies of Belonging. This series will feature intimate conversations with diverse advocates, scholars, artists, business leaders, and other thinkers who share a commitment to strengthening belonging, even though they might not agree on how to get there. We have designed these conversations to be solutions and future-oriented, and not meant to reach consensus. Rather, they're also meant to show how disagreeing is not only possible, but also a necessary part of belonging. This is also a very special event because it's the first and launch event of the Democracy and Belonging Forum. This initiative of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley will bring together civic leaders in Europe and the US who are committed to advancing belonging, countering democracy, democratic degradation, and authoritarianism, bridging across the lines of difference while at the same time centering the needs and rights of marginalized groups. The forum will focus on relationship building, exchange, joint experimentation, and also the production and dissemination of resources. This is a joint enterprise between people of the US, of a variety of European countries. That's the beginning. It's not an effort to transpose, import, export concepts or practices from one place or another. We do not believe in a one-size-fits-all concept, but rather we believe in exchanging, learning, and growing together. So we hope that through this forum we will be able to do so. Particularly recent events of this last weekend has shown us also the interconnectedness of things. As Roe versus Wade was overturned in Spain, in Madrid, for example, we saw a demonstration against abortion. At the same time, it is also in Spain that a menstrual leave bill passed. The German parliament has just struck down Article 219, which didn't allow advertisement of abortions. Macron's parliamentary group has announced that it will present a bill to add the right of abortion to the French constitution. Clearly, events that happen in the world are interconnected, and at the same time, they also keep the national specificity. Each context is unique, so we want to make sure that that's front and center of our efforts as well. If you enjoyed this conversation, I would like to encourage you to subscribe, sign up to our news. You can find that on our website, democracyandbelongingforum.org, and follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, and just keep up with future conversations. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our wonderful ASL interpreters, Toy Bogan and Kenton Myers from Interpret, Educate, and Serve, as well as our wonderful, wonderful comms lead, Evan Yoshimoto, who is running the tech and communications backstage. I cannot imagine a better panel to get us started. I will introduce each of the speakers, all of whom have incredible bios, so I've had to shorten them significantly in the interest of time. I'm deeply appreciative of the company I am keeping here today. And also, I'm very thankful for everyone who's joining us in the first event from your home and from your workplace. We know also that there are visually impaired people in the audience. So as I introduce the speakers, I'll invite them as well to maybe share something visual about yourself or your surrounding that's special or meaningful to you. As for myself, I'm Miriam Juan-Torres. I'm speaking to you from Barcelona, where I live with my wonderful partner, Gerard. I'm petite, but want to think that mighty, have blue eyes, and I have a ficus behind me that I'm really desperately trying not to kill. John A. Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights, civil liberties, structural racism, housing, poverty, and democracy. He's the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of Berkeley, California. Hi, John. It's so nice to have you here.
It's great to be here. And should I describe myself?
If you feel like it, yes.
Yes, I use he, him pronouns. I'm at home, and I'm African-American, receding hairline with a gray beard. I'm wearing a burgundy shirt, and you can't see, even if you can see well visually, I'm rather tall, about 6'3". It's great to be here. Look forward to the conversation.
Thanks a lot, John. We also have here Rocío Martínez-Sampere. She's the Executive Director of the Felipe González Foundation, the foundation of the former President of Spain. Throughout her career, she has worked as an analyst in the City of London and with the Fabian Society. She also served as Chief of Staff for Narcís Serra and as the economics advisor to the former Catalan President, Pasqual Maragall. And she was also an elected member of parliament in Spain, as well as the spokeswoman for economics, budget, and finance. Hola, Rocío. It's so nice to have you here as well.
Hola, Miriam. Buenas tardes. Good evening. Good afternoon to everybody. Very honored to be here at this launch event of the Othering and Belonging Institute, which is, I think, a necessary initiative. So I thank all the team that has put it in place. Also the people here that are helping us develop it, not only Miriam, that she's a friend of mine. So I always thank her for everything, but also Toy, Evan, and everybody that it's making this possible. I am going to describe myself as well. I don't know if I'm going to be as precise as John was, but I am wearing this. I am a woman with quite long hair, rather tall. I'm speaking from Madrid. That's the city where I live now, although I'm originally from Barcelona and I have lived in London as well, which these are like the three cities that I really have into my heart, London, Barcelona, and Madrid. I'm wearing this blue jacket and a multicolored necklace that I don't know if you're able to see, but I really like it. So, and I hope we can have an interesting conversation about all the challenges that we have as global societies, that we do have a lot, and at least that we try to learn, exchange, and grow together, as Miriam was saying at the beginning, because I think we need to. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Rocío. We have also Stephen Hawkins here. Stephen leads More in Common's public opinion research to understand and address political polarization in the UK, the United States, United Kingdom, and Europe. He leads the research at More in Common. He has co-authored seminal works that have had wide impact and media coverage across a range of media outlets, from the New York Times to Fox News. Prior to More in Common, Stephen also advised public opinion strategies for Fortune 100 companies such as Microsoft and Ford, and public sector organizations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the UN Refugee Agency. Also, personally to me, it means a lot that Stephen is here today. I've had the honor of working with Stephen for the past 5 years and consider him a great colleague and friend. So thank you very much for joining us, Stephen, from Denver, Colorado.
Thank you so much, Miriam. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's exciting to see this event come together. So to describe myself, I'm a man in my mid-30s, also with a receding hairline, John. I can relate to you there. Wearing a white shirt, a white button-down shirt. I'm surrounded by artwork and photographs of places that my wife and I have lived. And as Miriam mentioned, I'm calling from Denver, Colorado. So thanks so much, Miriam. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. And finally, last but not least, by any means, Nani Jansen Reventlow is an award-winning human rights lawyer specialized in strategic litigation at the intersection of human rights, social justice, and technology. Nani is the founder of Systemic Justice, a new organization that seeks to radically transform how the law works for communities fighting for racial, social, and economic justice. Nani has an extensive background in promoting human rights in the digital context and in defending journalism and activities in some of the most repressive environments in the world. She previously founded and built the Digital Freedom Fund. Hi, Nani. So glad to have you here with us as well.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, and I'm really very much looking forward to the conversation. I am joining from a place about an hour away from Copenhagen in Denmark. I'm originally from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. I will describe myself. I'm a Black woman, soon to be 44. I'm of mixed heritage, so a white Dutch mother and a Black Malian father. I wear my hair back and up, to the dismay of my mother ever since I was young, because she thinks I should show my curls. I'm wearing a black V-neck sweater, which is covered in white dog hair. The dog is on the floor. It might make an appearance a little bit later. And I have a background that shows that there's a lot of green around me, because yeah, that's the garden of our summer house where we are at the moment.
Thank you so much, Nani. And as the moderator, I should probably not say so, but any dog appearances are very much welcome. I'd like to get us started with John. John, it feels like today we're facing a superstorm of challenges, from polarization, rising authoritarianism, the global climate crisis, inequality. How can a reorientation towards belonging help us counter the forces that seek to divide us? Or how can an ethic of bridging and belonging address the major crises facing both Europe and the US? Are our responses inadequate? How can bridging and belonging help? And can it really help in different contexts?
Well, thanks for the question. And, you know, in the time that I have, I was told to take about 5 to 7 minutes to answer this question. And of course, these questions could take 5 to 7 days, so I won't be adequate, but I'll at least try to give some large outlines. I think first of all is to be deliberate. And what you experience in terms of polarization, in terms of a number of the fracturing that's happening, not just in the United States and Europe, but actually the entire world. A lot of it's driven by fear of loss. There's also demographic changes that has been exploited, the fear of the other. And so one of the things we like to do in terms of sharpening our understanding of belonging is think about what's the opposite process to belonging. And that process is othering. That process is basically saying there's some people, for whatever reason, that not only don't belong, but they are a threat. And it could be immigrants, it could be linguistic, it could be religion, it could be anything, because these are social phenomena. This is not inevitable. There's no naturally other group. And the thing that's important is not just people liking or disliking each other. It's when the government itself participates in saying that some people don't belong. And so we say the solution to that problem is not the traditional liberal solution of saying we're going to fix othering by insisting that all people are the same. Yes, we are profoundly connected, and as Stephen will say, we have more in common, but we're also different. And so belonging acknowledges that we're both the same and different, and that we don't have to give up our apparent differences to belong. Belonging also is predicated on the notion that people get to co-create the thing they belong to. That is, people don't come in just as guests that can be uninvited at any time. So I think that we haven't sharpened what we're trying to do. And Miriam, as you suggested, each society, each country has its own way of expressing this. But virtually all countries, starting even with citizenship, has some way of saying to people, you more or less belong, or you don't belong. You're here as a guest worker, you're here as an immigrant, you're here on a visa. We could take that away from you. Or you might have been living here for 3 or 4 generations, but because of the color of your skin or your accent, your religion, you really don't belong. I was in France several years ago after there had been some riots in the suburbs doing some work, and one of my hosts told me a story. He's Black in terms of pigmentation, and he's saying he frequently gets the question, "Where are you from?" And he would say, "Paris." So, okay, but no, where's your family from? Paris. Okay, you know what I'm asking. And what the person was really saying is, I don't care if you've lived here for 4 generations, you're not really French, you're not a Parisian. So I think part of the thing is to be deliberate at various levels. And part of that deliberation, which you also touched on, Miriam, in terms of bridging. So if we talk about people can be different, have different perspectives, different ways of eating, different ways of dressing, different language, how do they come together? And one of the ways is bridging. And bridging is, again, a concept that deserves a lot more attention than I can give it right now, but it's acknowledging not only everyone's humanity, they were all human. We all belong in the largest sense. We belong to the earth, and the earth belongs to us. We also belong in our neighborhood. We belong in our families. We belong in our communities. But what about when we have differences? What about when we have conflict? What do we do with that? One thing to do with it is to deny the other person's not only being right, but say, if you hold that position, you don't belong or you're not human. We demonize them. And so it's important that even where we have disagreement, maybe especially where we have disagreement, to find a way to bridge, to find a way to hold on to each other's humanity, to acknowledge each other's humanity. And there are various things we can do, both physically and socially, to bridge. But to begin with, it's just to listen. Be willing to engage in what Tanya Singer calls compassionate listening, to listen to the other person's story, to listen to their pain, to listen to their aspiration. And this may sound like a small thing, but oftentimes we push back because we think, well, I don't want to listen to you because I don't agree with you. But listening does not constitute agreement. It constitutes acknowledging our shared humanity. And then we can think about what can we do in terms of organizations, in terms of structures, in terms of culture, to say to people that we're listening to you, we want to hear from you, and we want you to listen to us. So that's bridging. Instead, what we do is what we call breaking. That is, we take the other person and say they're less than, we tell stories about them, we depict them in negative ways, we exaggerate things about them, we flatten them. So to listen deeply is to recognize each other's complexity, to recognize each other's multiplicity. That involves bridging. Breaking is the opposite. We flatten people. They become two-dimensional. We actually don't know much about them. We don't want to know much about them. We make up things about them. We don't want to hear their own voice. We talk about them instead of to them. So those are some of the things we can begin to do. And as you suggested, Miriam, this is not just a U.S. issue. It's a European issue. It's a global issue. But we also have to respect that the different ways these processes of bridging and breaking and belonging happen. Finally, I'll just say belonging is both a noun and a verb. It's a process. It's dynamic. It's how we feel, but it's also how we're seen and treated. It happens at an individual level. How do I feel? But it's also happened as a group level. How is my group treated? So these are issues that unfortunately will become more important as the world continues to change and as we become more diverse through movement and immigration.
Thank you, John. Rocio, I'd like to go to you next. You are someone who's been involved in politics also in a country that's rapidly polarizing. You have vast experience with the work that you do with the foundations and in economics as well. And I'd like to hear from you as well, like whether we really are in a crisis of democracy. Where do we spot those tensions or this crisis that we mentioned? And then how do belonging and democracy intersect? And what are the challenges that you think we're facing? I think you're on mute still. Sorry, can you? Don't worry.
Sorry,
it happens
sorry
always.
for that. I was just thanking you again and the Othering and Belonging Institute for letting me the possibility to speak today at this event. And certainly, I remember the other day, I'm not going to say who, but she's certainly in this panel with me, that we were discussing some issues and she was telling me, look, at the end of the day, of all the problems that we're having, and as you just mentioned, Spain is one of the best countries nowadays. But at the end of the day, if me as a young woman would have to choose a time in history to be born in terms of rights and recognition, I would certainly choose today, right? So sometimes it's important that we not lose the big perspective, right? But even if this is true, it's also true at the same time, although it seems a contradiction, that we're fearing that we are like crabs, like moving backwards, not forwards, right? And that our democracies are really suffering from structural problems. And certainly belonging or the recognition of and our diversity and our senses of identity, that we all have multiple identities that are important, that we live with all of them, are suffering. Now, how can we deal with that? Because it's true that democracy, sometimes the defense of democracy, I say the word, I know it's not very appropriate, but it's not the most sexiest thing in the world, right? Because obviously when you defend institutions and procedures, this is not something that calls to our emotions. And at the same time, we are living in this world where politics and our, let's say, public conversation is highly emotional and with an hypertrophy of moralization. And this certainly brings problems to the understanding of the othering. So we're seeing at the same time this phenomena that John was just mentioning, that at the same time that we seek to recognize our belongings, our identities, that this is part of the human nature, we might be increasing the sense of othering. So how do we combine diversity with what unites us together? That is, at the end of the day, the most important pact in our societies is that we are all citizens, full right citizens, with our differences, right? And I don't think we have the immediate solution for that. We are seeing, you were just mentioning these last week examples that certainly worry me. But maybe, and I'm just saying this out of experience from the work we do at our foundation, maybe the solution is to build bridges in other dimensions. Let me try to explain a bit more. In order to do not increase the sense of othering, the sense of political polarization that we see in Europe, that is different from the polarization that I think we see in the United States. It has different dimensions, but we are seeing, for instance, in Spain, a huge political polarization. We have this initiative in our foundation that we call the Revolution of the Little Things, where we put very different people from very different trajectories, very different ideologies together, and we make them discuss a very specific, concrete, and small problem to be solved. And they come together, and as long as the issue is, let's say, I wouldn't say technical, but very, very concrete, very, very small, very, very an ideological problem, they come together, they normally agree, and this builds bridges to recognize the other, right? So maybe a solution to the crisis of democracy that we are seeing, let's say, all over the Western world at least, is to try to build bridges in other dimensions to try to strengthen the sense of citizenship, that we should be all full right citizens. Because sometimes my fear is that we are losing the perspective, right? That the diversity of our sense of multiple identities that we all have and the recognition that we all have to have, they can only come together in institutionalized democracies with the strengthening of citizenship. And this implies politics. I know that this is not a la mode, but this implies having a political project that treats us all as citizens and gives us all, let's say, at least a short-term or a medium-term project of progress where more or less we can all fit together. Because otherwise, when the only issue of discussion is identity, this makes it very difficult because either you have it or you don't. So there is no combination. There is no possibility of agreement between that. We can disagree. It's democracy is an imperfect combination, an imperfect conversation between agreement and disagreement. So this is not the problem, but we need to have some common perspective that unites us all, right? As long as we're seeing in our societies, and this is like the good part, right? A conversation, multiple voices that demand belonging, that demand recognition, that demand new rights. In order to include them, we need to reform our institutions to allow for more diversity. Otherwise, this would be impossible to govern. But we cannot lose the political perspective. Because if we only speak in terms of morality, the moralization of politics implies that, you're good and the other is bad. And we need to return to the political discussion, where agreement on things or disagreement on other things is what we are judging. Otherwise, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for our democracies to regain a path that can allow at the same time, and I mean it, we need to do reforms on that, because our institutions at the moment are not designed to include this diversity, and we need to reform them. But otherwise, we will not be able to combine this citizenship that it is for everybody, a full right citizenship, with the diverse and the diversity and the multiple identities that we need to live with in our modern societies, right? So I would say, let's bring politics back into the table, because I know that we are super politicized at this moment, but at the same time, we are not speaking about what politics should be speaking. So I know it sounds contradictory, but I would say, let's bring this bidimensional conversation back to the table. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for us to find a path forward of reform with more diversity and more rights for everybody. And I would leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Rocío. Muchas gracias. Steven, you have vast experience in public opinion research, in polarization. How does this fit into this conversation? How does belonging play out in what you've seen? How do polarization, belonging, and the current state of democracy fit with each other?
Thank you, Miriam. Well, I want to build a little bit off of what Rocío was saying there about having the big picture perspective, and also about democracy being an imperfect conversation. So just to sort of calibrate the existing feelings towards democracy relative to what the ideal should be. So in my view, the ideal for democracy is that most people should be a little bit dissatisfied all the time. Because as Rocío was saying about it being an imperfect conversation, agreement, disagreement, democracy is fundamentally a negotiation. And the sign of an effective negotiation is that multiple parties, both parties in the negotiation, are a little bit dissatisfied with what they got, because neither party had a fully triumphant victory. And so democracy should always feel probably a little bit dissatisfying, as long as there is a population that has a range and diversity of political goals and opinions and ideal perspectives. Nobody will have the full entirety of the society that they want. And so democracy should always be a little bit of a frustrating game, but it shouldn't be agonizingly painful for any subgroup, nor should it be the triumphant full picture of what any particular group wants. But with even that lower benchmark for what democracy ought to feel like, the current status of people's feelings towards democracy does give reason to be concerned. And I want to talk through what some of those points are. As Miriam mentioned, we've been conducting research on attitudes towards democracy in a range of countries in Europe, so France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, as well as in the United States. And there are some things that are common across those countries, and there are some things that are distinct. So I'll start with the things that are common. The first is a worrying lack of enthusiasm for democracy in terms of how it's functioning today. As I said before, I don't think it needs to be sky high, but it is low. And related to that is a very worrying lack of trust. There isn't today in the countries I just mentioned any country where a majority of the population trusts its head of state. In the United States, there is not any major national institution, not media, not the federal government, not major corporations that enjoy more than 25% of the public's trust. And so we see that there is a suspicion and a lack of confidence in their institutions that are governing society that is a problem that needs to be addressed. At the same time, there's not an alternative system that's competing. And this was one of our key findings from research that we did in 2019 and 2020, which is that there's not a voice for something other than democracy, which is making an active case in the Western world that instead we ought to have an autocratic system, or that we ought to have something which has less participation from the citizenry. And so what we see is people dissatisfied with what they see as still the best possible form of government. Another thing that's really noteworthy about this time is we asked people across those handful of Western European countries and the United States this question: what words would you use to describe your country today? And we gave them a dozen good words and a dozen critical words. So take a moment. What would you use to describe the United States today, or the country you live in Europe today, if you could just pick one word? So the most common word we found in every country was divided. There's one exception, which is Italy, which picked corrupt first and then divided. But divided is picked by between 40 and 60% of people across countries. And positive words like united, like polite, come down to around like 2-3%, maybe 4%. And so we're seeing that there is a 10-20x higher reception, or perception rather, of division rather than of commonality. And so that feeling of, I don't trust our institutions, our society feels deeply divided, is worrying. And then compounding on top of that is a new trend, which we don't see everywhere. In the United States, in Poland, in Spain, we see more of this. I would say more stable democracies like the UK and Germany see less of this. But not just competing perspectives in terms of different values, right? We see the same country, but once, for instance, rather than seeing the same society, but believing, I believe more in family values, and the other person believes more in individual freedoms. One's more traditional, the other is more liberal. This is a conventional form of political disagreement. What we now see is more of a fracturing of reality, where you take a year like 2021, which is a year of pandemic inside a broader global crisis of climate change with a change in president. And in the United States, for instance, we're divided on all three of those major big picture questions. Is the climate heating up? What's causing it? Is there a pandemic? And what's the answer to it? And who is the rightful president of the United States? Those big picture questions about the most fundamental features of our reality are now contentious. And so we would consider that a fracturing of reality, and that poses a significant threat to our ability to identify problems and solve them collectively through democratic institutions. And so that's where we get to this point of the continuum, where it isn't a single crisis of democracy. In Germany, we've just had a major change, a new chapter in German leadership as Angela Merkel steps down, and we see different parties coming together, negotiating a legislative agenda, agreeing on the major points of that, and then beginning a new session. And that, from the perspective of an American, looks quite idyllic and quite successful. And so we see that not every country in the West is suffering from a dysfunction, even if they are suffering from division and dissatisfaction and distrust. They're not necessarily struggling to actually achieve legislative goals. But there are reasons to be quite worried, I think, about the democracy in the United States. And I'll just close my remarks by noting what some of those are, in addition to what I've already said. And I think the big picture frame here is that major institutions are sensing threat. And in their sense of threat, their fear of the status quo changing in a way that would make them and the people they care about the most, or they and the people they care about worse off. Institutions and individuals seem to be departing from their best guiding principles towards self-interest or towards a kind of partisan alignment. And we see this in on the right side of the aisle with the Republican Party, and the way that their commitment to an objective reading of the 2020 election is not one they're committed to, in my opinion. We see this also with this new type of a sense of threat, for instance, that Donald Trump would be reelected, serving as the motivation for mainstream media and social media platforms deciding to give very little or no coverage to critical stories, for instance, about Biden's family and his corruption. These stories have since been corroborated, but they were buried at a time when they potentially could have helped Donald Trump win re-election. And so these departures of commitment to the institutions of objectivity or to the institutions of democratic fairness are worsening this crisis of distrust that we're seeing in the United States, where there's a sense that major institutions are allied with political parties and political outcomes. And therefore, you can't trust the media, and you probably can't trust federal institutions, and you certainly can't trust big business. And this is a problem where, as this sense of threat grows, the acceleration of a departure from guiding principles may also increase. And so looking forward to the rest of the conversation, where maybe we can have some brainstorms about what it would mean for us to restore a sense of commitment to guiding principles of rule of law, democratic fairness, of objectivity in news reporting, of parity and equality and transparency in social media discourse. Because at the moment, I think the United States is in a dangerous trajectory in a way that isn't unique in the West, but is certainly very concerning specifically, and has parallels probably most closely in Europe in places like Poland and Spain. And so with that, Miriam, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And John has talked to us about belonging, about othering, the other process. It's talked to us about bridging and breaking. And Rocio was also mentioning the importance of the institutions. The truth is that, like, to advance belonging or to maintain human rights, oftentimes we need institutions that will defend them. And Stephen was mentioning as well, like, the crisis of trust that we are experimenting. The role of identities has also come into place. But something that I believe is also of very real concern is what happens when it's just not about some political or policy disagreements. There are some human rights that we have been defending that were enshrined in the Declaration for many years. We talk about social justice. We talk about identity and identity politics, but of course, there's also the need to protect certain identities and the realities that some people face. So, Nani, my question to you is, what are the challenges to belonging and to bridging? And in the democracy conversation, when we are thinking about social justice or speaking from a human rights perspective?
Thank you. Great question. I just want to say that Sambal, the dog, came to say hi to you. He heard you welcoming him into the panel. I think that there are 3 points in particular that I think are important to keep in mind when thinking of the idea of belonging and bridging, but also the human rights perspective in there. One thing is the importance of making sure that we actually embrace the idea of difference. You just pointed to the fact that it's also important to protect certain identities specifically because they can be harder hit by the inequalities and the power structures in our society. So as a human rights lawyer, that would actually be a very important point to kind of like keep in focus. But from an activist perspective and from an organizing perspective, I also think to think about it in a slightly more holistic way and really embracing difference also as a source of power. And I think that that's not necessarily contradictory to what was said earlier. There was an emphasis, right, on making sure that it's really clear that we're thinking about belonging not as kind of like uniformity or as sameness. But I do think that especially in situations where we're trying to bring about bigger social change, embracing the difference and thinking of things like as strategic unity are really important because we're up against really significant challenges. A second point that I think is important to think about is the need in all of this to acknowledge the historical inequalities and the historical injustices that many of us have suffered and that are still present in our societies today. I think there of issues such as, reparations, healing, restoration. There also has to be education. And these steps cannot be skipped if we want to get to a constructive place of belonging for all of us. One of the participants in the anti-racism roundtable conversation that we hosted last week was referring to the concept of colonial forgetfulness that we see around Europe. The failure to acknowledge genocides that took place, the failure to wanting to set up systems for reparations. Those are all things that we actually need to grapple with and face before we can actually get to a place where we can have a structure in which we can also, disagree with each other in a constructive way. And another kind of subpoint there is the fact that we're seeing across Europe by different governments the active erasure of difference, removing the concept of race out of constitutions for special protections against discrimination, the lack of engagement with collecting data on how different groups are treated differently within our societies. Those are all things that are standing in the way for getting a more just outcome for marginalized groups. And the last point, that's a very practical one, actually, and that's about the division of labor in all of this when we're looking at bridging. Who is doing the bridging? Who is doing the work in order to make sure that we stop excluding? And I think that a lot of that labor needs to lie with the people benefiting from the systems of exclusion that we currently see. Much more so than the groups that are being marginalized. But then at the same time, how do you balance that out with making sure that they don't end up being centered in the conversation once again, and it all leading to an inequitable outcome for those who are currently being excluded? So those would be like the points for consideration I'd like to bring into the conversation. I hope Samuel wasn't snoring too loudly, because he actually is right now. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Nani. We are seeing a lot of things coming to the front in this conversation. John, you talked about bridging, about belonging. We also hear the conversations about how on the one hand we need to make sure that there's space for multiple identities, at the same time, like the need to maybe build a common project, or democracy can falter. Particularly in light of the events of the past few days, I wonder as well whether there are any times at which we don't reach. Because talking about belonging, I think, as a goal, as an utopia almost, is, I think, beautiful, and something that would be difficult for anyone to object to. Bridging is a little bit trickier, and when there are some fundamental things that are being discussed, like how do we bridge, and are there any circumstances in which we don't bridge? And I'd like to invite you all to answer this question, but maybe we can start with John.
Well, thanks for the question and the conversation. I want to touch on a couple of points. So I agree. It was suggested earlier that we bring politics or institutions back into the conversations. I think that's critical. So the misapprehension about bridging is that it's agreement. And I would start going back again to, we talk about belonging without othering. Belonging without othering. There's a lot of people who constitute belonging by othering. That is, you define your group in opposition to another group. That's not what we're talking about. And so to the extent that bridging is about recognizing everyone's humanity, but everyone, there's no place where you say, okay, we're not going to recognize that person's humanity. So even where there's fundamental difference, we don't have to struggle over those differences, as Stephen suggested. It doesn't mean that we therefore deny people's humanity. And that's what makes this place we're in so toxic, because it's not just disagreement. We're denying the humanity of those that we oppose. In the US context, it's historical. In the US context, it's institutional, where Blacks were Native Americans, were women. Until 1920, women could not vote. So you have to struggle against that. But it doesn't mean in that struggle, you dehumanize the group you're struggling against. And that's the contradiction and tension. And I just want to make one small, I guess, adjustment. So we talk about human rights, and we also talk about citizens. It's complicated, right? Because in the United States, there are 11 million people living here who've lived here most of their lives who are not citizens. How do we relate to that group? Or in parts of Spain, there's the Romas who are clearly citizens and they're not treated as belonging. So I think belonging actually extends beyond. I think citizenship is an important aspect of a political project, of a national project, but it's not coextensive. So when we talk about human rights, that's different than citizenship. I think we have to be very, very careful in terms of creating too many conditions and too many exceptions to bridging. Again, if we start with bridging, is predicated on the notion that this person disagrees with me, this person is maybe even hurting me, but it's still a person, it's still a human being. Now that may sound idyllic, it's actually not. Think about it. Most of the countries in Europe and many countries like Canada actually eliminated the death penalty. What does that actually suggest? Well, if you go back to the debate, because all those countries at one point had the death penalty, virtually all of them. And when they moved from the death penalty to not having a death penalty, the discussion was, this person's done something terrible. Maybe killed someone, maybe raped someone, maybe blew up a building. Therefore, should this person die? So does this person cease to be a human being? And sometimes the discussion took place in the context of a morality. Sometimes it took place in the context of religion. This person is still a child of God. There was still some recognition in the person's humanity. And in terms of recognizing this person's humanity, the real humanization took place not to the person that had done something terrible, but to the society itself. That when you dehumanize someone, when you break with someone, when you refuse to recognize someone else's humanity, you begin to destroy your own humanity. And when you do that as an institution, it's even worse. And then the last thing I'll say is that part of the thing that's roiling these threats and this fear that was discussed by others is the changing demographics, is the fear of the other, even if the other is not present, like in Hungary, for example, which doesn't have a very large immigrant population, but there's a tremendous fear of the other, tremendous fear of change. And I think we have to embrace the fear, and by embracing, acknowledge it, and then help people pivot to a future where we all belong, but all of us. So I would say bridging is not easy. Holding belonging is not easy, but it's an aspiration we really should orient toward.
Thank you, John. And I'll pass on to Rocio.
Yes, John, but let me, because Miriam was doing a very difficult question. It's like, when do we not breach? Do we always breach? Do we breach, for instance, with non-human rights defenders? I mean, I don't know, because bridging is indeed a tricky thing. I understand it in terms of aspiration, but it's not always possible. That's why I was defending before that maybe we should build other sort of bridges that help to understand the other and then make bridging again easier, right? But sometimes we need to acknowledge that it's not always possible. When I'm referring to citizenship, maybe here is a difference between Europe, or at least Spain, and the US. It's because when I say our most important agreement that unites us all is a full right citizenship, I understand that these citizenship rights are based on a liberal and progressive written constitution that we have, right? So it's like, well, it's the place where we can, with some reforms that integrate diversity better, we can at least find us all together right here. That's why I was referring to citizenship, because otherwise sometimes it's difficult to breach, right, with people that are defending things that are, radically opposite to some very basic rights. So here, Miriam, I understand your question, and it has not an easy answer. Second of all, I did say that we should bring politics and institutions into the conversation, and I really think so. But I would add two other dimensions. One is ideas, because I think Nani mentioned it as well. We have a narrative where equality is uniformity, and equality is not uniformity. We can be equals and diverse, right? Because it's treating the equals equal and the different. This is equality, and I don't think we do have this sort of narrative, and we must insist on that it is possible to defend equality and defend diversity at the same time. And I think we need battle of ideas here. And the second dimension that it's more difficult to solve is power, because we have to acknowledge overall in this 21st century that started with the, with the wall tower, with the attack of the Twin Towers, then the financial crisis, then the COVID crisis. We know that where we hold, where the power is decided, which is clearly a global conversation. Also, social media is global information, but we do not have any sort of global power. And we demand to our national government things that they cannot deliver, even if they want to. Sometimes they don't even want to, but when they want to deliver them, they cannot. So there's a structural frustration with what can we get from power. And I think sometimes it's very difficult for all of us to have this power conversation, but I think it's a conversation that we have to have, right? Who has the power? How do we control it? How do we integrate or do reforms and on how these powers operate? How do we make them accountable? And I think this is still a pending conversation that I know it's very difficult, but we need to have it as well. So I would bring ideas and power onto the table as well.
Thanks, Rocío. Stephen, you wanted to jump in?
Yes. I want to jump in maybe to be a little bit provocative. I think I want to raise a question with the group, which is about whether we should be aiming for convergence of perspective, because I want to take up the example you're suggesting, Miriam, around abortion and the change in legality of abortion in the United States recently, where from one perspective, and let me just pause and say parenthetically, I used to be a very conservative person, and in my past participated in a right to life protests and rallies. I've done pro-life advocacy in my past, debates and so on. And that today I'm secular and pro-choice. But the difference between those two perspectives was not that I changed my perspective on the humanity of women. It was that I changed my perspective on the humanity of the fetus. And this is a very difficult ethical question where Americans are on a sliding scale in determining where they see the value of human life emerging in the process of pregnancy. And therefore, I think that it's tempting to see this issue as one of bigotry or inhumanity on one side and progress and humanity on the other. I think it's more complex than that. I marched alongside thousands and thousands of women who believed that there was something sacred and very fundamental. What could be more fundamental than the right to exist in protecting those lives from abortion? And so I guess the question is, if we imagine 20, 30, 70 years from now in the United States that those perspectives still persist, where some people view something sacred at the earliest stages of pregnancy and others do not, how can we converge in a place of shared belonging? How can we bridge that, right? Without setting the goal of having us converge over time to a shared perspective. And so I guess that's the question is, to John and to others, should we be seeking to actually have less disagreement over our kind of worldviews over time, or should we see those as fixed and sacred parts of our society that we want to preserve?
I'll give us a moment if we want to collect our ideas, because obviously there's a lot that's been placed in the table right now in the last few interventions. And I think that this conversation is interesting as well, because it is surfacing a lot of the tensions that we are experiencing in polarized societies, in societies where we're seeing an erosion in the trust in democracy, where we're seeing institutions that are necessary, but at the same time, sometimes are failing or being instrumentalized. Intentions that when we speak about belonging, about citizenship, because there's a question as well about, in a world where not everyone has access to citizenship, can we still speak about everyone belonging? And in a world where there are so big fundamental viewpoints, as Stephen was mentioning, can we not try to convince the other or accept that convergence in opinions will not exist and still not dehumanize or demonize the other? Also acknowledging at the same time all of the institutional and democratic backdrop against which all of this is happening. So I'd like to invite the other speakers as well to reflect on Stephen's provocation or anything of what's been
Mary, I have some thoughts, but before I respond, I want to make sure that Nani has a chance to respond, because she hasn't.
I just have some very brief reflections on the citizenship point. I appreciate kind of like trying to think of that in the context of trying to build bridges to better understand others, to come to a situation of bridging and have a more binary choice, so to speak. But for reasons that John also just pointed out, I really struggle with looking at citizenship as a frame to productively work with. Not only because I do feel that it has that kind of like acknowledging other people's humanity just needs to be a fundamental choice that goes beyond that type of classification. Just the same way that we, try to look at human rights as universal, there's all sorts of asterisks there, of course, as to like who came up with the system and who enforces it, etc. And here we come back to the question of power. But also because we are seeing on a daily basis how citizenship and belonging quite often do not correspond with each other, right? The example was just mentioned about the Roma population in many different locations in Europe, but also, not wanting to scapegoat one particular country, but an example of like how citizenship still means very little for belonging is France, where you can have citizenship all you want if you're a Muslim French person, if you are someone who is descendant from one of the former French colonies, you're still not going to be considered as a real French person, if I can put it that way. So the citizenship part is really difficult. So just to stop on that topic now, and just one really brief comment on what Stephen just said, because I'm really curious to hear what John's response is to the provocation. I find it a really difficult example to kind of like work with the Dobbs decision for the provocation, because for convergence of perspective, I think this is exactly an example of where power is being wielded by a specific group of people, what came out of the Supreme Court recently. If you look at public opinion in the US, the decision should not have gone that way. So I think that there's a lot more in the mix than like what do we all agree on. Anyways, I'll stop talking now. I'm curious to hear what John has to say.
So, Stephen, the provocation is, I think, very useful, but actually, you actually helped us at the beginning in terms of dealing with it when you said democracy is not about agreement. So when we talk about bridging, we're not talking about a convergence. We're talking about acknowledging someone else's humanity that we don't agree with. And to bring it, to make it a little bit more real, many people have heard me before. I talk about my family. My father's a Christian minister, and in terms of very much against the right of abortion. We discussed that, not debated it. We discussed it and inquired what each other's feelings were about it many times. And in that process, there was profound bridging. There was profound love. There was profound respect. There wasn't agreement. There wasn't a conversion on ideas. We're not talking about bridging ideas. We're talking about recognizing people's humanity. Now, actually, interesting, the research shows that when that actually happens, something happens. That more often than not, people do start to shift. But bridging cannot be about persuasion. If we're only listening to someone for the point of changing them, that's not bridging, that's persuasion. I'm going to listen to my gay son talk about being gay, so at the end of the discussion, he's no longer gay. That's not seeing him, that's changing him. And I think there are many more possibilities than what's let out. And I completely agree with the idea that we have to look at power. I think power is part of the discussion. You sort of suggested, Stephen, that 20, 30 years from now, we still have this division. In 20 or 30 years, my guess is science will take this issue off the table completely. But that's not the point. The point is that when we disagree, how do we actually, through our institutions, through our structures, through our efforts, hold on to each other's humanity? Now, I agree with, I just wrote something on this decision, basically saying the institutions fail. Institutions failed before we got to this decision. And you follow what happened with the United States. I won't go through all the details, but President Obama nominated someone to the Supreme Court a year before he got out of office. Mitch McConnell said, because you're leaving office in a year, we won't have hearings on this person, John Garland. Amy Barrett was nominated and confirmed 2 weeks before the election of President Biden. Institutionally, the institutional apparatus for putting someone on the Supreme Court was violated for the point of overturning Roe v. Wade. So I feel like the institutional integrity, you talk about trust of institutions, I feel like we cannot trust the institution. The last thing I'll say, and I don't want to get too specific, President Trump is the only president in US history that was impeached twice. Impeached twice. And then you have this, from my perspective, corrupt way of putting 3 members on the court. Should we be bound by that court, whether we like what they do or not? To me, that doesn't support any kind of trust in the institution. You violated your own internal rules to stack the deck. And now you're saying respect our opinion, which is different than how should we think about abortion and pro-life and pro-choice. But I think disagreeing with people and bridging does not mean an ideological conversion. It means something else quite different.
Yes,
Thank you.
Totally.
Thank you, John. Go ahead, Rocío.
Sorry, Miriam. In this, I totally agree with John, Stephen, about your provocation. Just let me add, it's like, with this specific issue, right? Right to abortion is not an obligation to, right? And I think sometimes it's very important to understand that we need, I said at the beginning, it's a combination between agreement and disagreement, and disagreement is not distraction. We can disagree while we do it with respect and without dehumanization. But my position at the same time is that certain rights need at least to be allowed to exercise. Otherwise, it's impossible for for the combination of disagreement and disagreement. So for me, it's a clear step back what happened last week with the Supreme Court of the United States. Having said that, and coming back to the citizenship point, because I understand both John and Nani's points, obviously what we had until today is not perfect at all. It's like far from perfect. We need more inclusion, but my problem is that if we want a society that has the recognition of identity and belonging, an identity that it's a multiple identity, because we have more than one sometimes, right? And we have this, and we want bridging that sometimes this bridging is imperfect, and sometimes even with Miriam's before question, we cannot bridge with some issues because it's almost impossible. What do we have that unites us? What do we have? And to me, a citizenship, but I'm meaning like a full right citizenship. It's not like you are just a citizen and have an ID card. I'm not referring to that, obviously, right? It's like a full sense of right and obligation. And from, if you want a progressive perspective in terms of rights, I think that is at least a starting place where we can combine these issues that brings us here. So diversity and inclusion with a common purpose. Otherwise, I know the imperfection on that, Nani, but I cannot visualize a better scenario. I don't know what a better scenario would be. And with a better scenario, I mean one that it's not reversible, right? If the power structure changes. So I still think this is our best proxy to integrate diversity and inclusion. Just wanted to make this point because I know that you are in disagreement, both you and John. That's why. But you can keep disagreeing, Nani. So
No, I don't want to kind of
no,
have a really long debate.
I know, I'm interested. No, I know we don't have time for a long debate. Next time.
No. So why don't we just revisit this another time? I'd love to talk about this a little bit more. There's an issue with the reversibility question. I think also with the diversity and inclusion framing. But yeah, that would take me a little while. So I'm sure that Miriam might also want to talk about some other things. But let's park this one.
Oh, before we completely park it, let me just say,
go ahead, John, and then we'll move on to Stephen.
Okay, I agree. So again, the point is not really agree or disagree, but I think there are better solutions. And I think you actually pointed to one when you talked about global power. So someone's humanity should not be determined by where they live. It's like, or if they're stateless. I believe, and would posit that everyone belongs. Everyone belongs. And I'm not saying that everyone has all the same rights, but we are living in a world that's increasingly global. We made it, you talk about structural problems, we make it so that capital can flit around the world in nanoseconds, and yet people are stuck at borders. So I think that we can do something better. We have to align the structures together. But at a minimum, I would say, when we talk about human rights, we don't say human rights depending on your citizenship. We say they're basic human rights that should not be violated. And I would say belonging is one of those things we should aspire to, that people should count and be treated with dignity and respect. And it's not based on them being French or Spanish or American. It's based on them being human, based on them being alive. And how do we get there? I don't know. But I think we don't get there unless we hold on to it. But in the meantime, I agree, citizenship is important. But I wrote a piece where I talk about membership, deliberately not talking about citizenship. Because like I said, what do we do about the 11 million people who live in the United States who don't have citizenship?
Yeah, this is surfacing interesting things as well in how we talk about things. And then like the reality is that we are in different contexts where these words also have separate and not necessarily equal meanings. Then also obviously this idea that oftentimes, and when we think about belonging, what we will be thinking about is also about citizenship and the rights granted in the state. But in reality, often when we're talking about belonging, that's not exactly what we're talking about. It's something larger that's not contingent on citizenship, as John was saying. Stephen, you wanted to contribute as well.
Well, I'll be brief unless you want to wrap us up in the next few minutes here with some concluding thoughts. But I want to also just raise a point around epistemology. How do we determine what's true? How do we determine what information to care about? It feels to me that either whether we're talking about citizenship or whether we're talking about bridging, if we have an inability to arrive at what we consider to be valid information, which is certainly one of the problems in the United States, it's hard for me to imagine there not being very clunky, difficult, continued impasses in our society. And I'll just give one example and then be quiet. I was listening to an evangelical speaker yesterday who talked about there being a very large contingent of the evangelical population that believes that Donald Trump was prophesied to be the president of the United States and that he would have a huge role to play. And that conviction was a big part of why the white evangelical community was the core of Donald Trump's base, the subpopulation that had the highest percentage of support for him. How do we navigate that when we can't, there's no mechanism of arriving at a shared conclusion if one of the premises is, well, God told me the answer already. And so I think there's more, I'm less optimistic about bridging perspectives only through conversation without there being more of a convergence around shared values and a common method of shared epistemology. And I think in Western societies where we've seen more of that, such as in Germany, we see a more functional conversation. And I see that as an impasse, at least in the United States and other places. But I'm curious if others have thoughts on that before we wrap up.
Stephen, you're coming in with the hard questions today. I hope we will continue. Go ahead, John.
I hate to take up so much airspace, but in a sense, Stephen, I start from a different premise. I think of Hannah Arendt, who talks about when you have total truth, you have totalitarianism. So I don't think the goal is to get to some absolute truth. And I think one of the dangers, frankly, of religions are just thinking that they do have sacred truth. But we live in a society that's apparently pluralistic. And one of the discussions I had with my dad when I talked about this, he's passed away, is that, you want to decide on your faith, what do you do with someone who has a very different faith? Do you wipe that person out? You say that person doesn't count? You say that person's God is not real? So part of it is not, as you said, democracy can't be about always winning. And so how do you live with people? How do you come together with people who are different than you? And it can't be, in good faith, we disagree on even if there's a God, right? Doesn't mean, therefore, the person, you can't live together. So I think the problem is not quite as sticky as you're making it. My caring and loving for my father was not because we agreed on the teaching of the Bible. That was a sacred book to him. It was just a book to me. But we did agree on something. We came together on our shared humanity, on our caring for each other. And I cared about him. I still care about him. So there's a saying that love goes many places, understanding cannot. And so caring for people is not the same as just agreeing with them. So I think while it doesn't make the issue goes away, I think it reframes it.
Thank you, John. I want to give, extend my gratitude to all of the speakers for this wonderful conversation. I will give you all 1 minute for final remarks, if you wish to share any. So Nani, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful conversation. Lots of food for thought and lots of strands of this conversation that I'd like to continue at a later stage. I guess that the main thing that I'll be pondering over the coming hours and probably the coming days is how do you operationalize some of these really beautiful visions, right, for a different kind of society and this concept of belonging. There's one kind of like interesting kind of like through line that I'm seeing from some of the really difficult conversations we've been having over the past months in the consultation process at Systemic Justice, where we've been talking about challenges, right, that people are seeing when it comes to racial, social, and economic justice in Europe, and that in almost every single conversation there, this idea of indeed like having that there has to be, that love has to be central in all of these struggles has come up. And I find it really beautiful that it came back in this conversation regularly as well. And yeah, it's about how can we hang on to that vision, to that positive sentiment in a context where, you know, as our the debates about citizenship just illustrated, how do you operationalize that in a context where you still have to deal with very specific structures and processes in our societies, that you have to contend with, some of which we might be able to change also. But yeah, this is an interesting tension and something I'd love to explore a bit further. Thank you.
Thank you, Nani. Rocio?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Miriam, for this fantastic and finished conversation. As all clever conversations, more answers than questions. That's my final conclusion, because the big question of how do we combine agreement and disagreement with, or belonging and bridging without, you know, meeting personally the other, like more than father and son relation. How do we do it? I don't know, but I know that in this conversation we have to bring back concepts, very classic concepts, such as politics, such as power, such as institutions, how do we reform institutions for that, diversity, and new ideas, because it's always also a matter of values and ideas.
Thanks, Rocio. Muchas gracias. Steven?
Thanks so much, everyone. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think what gives me hope at the moment is seeing people who engage in vulnerability and who are sincere and risk seeming naive in their efforts to try and turn society into a place where there's more trust and where there's more functional democracy. So I hope to be one of those people and very much admire each of you for playing that role as well. Let's continue to be ambitious and even risk seeming naive in our effort to avoid the trends continuing to worsen.
Thank you so much. And John?
So thank you, Miriam, and thank all of you for spending the last hour and a half. And I wish we could spend more time. And I think these are difficult problems, but they're not intractable. And I think one of the roles of institutions and structures is to help us hold together when we do disagree. But right now, those institutions are fraying themselves. So I think we don't have any choice but to figure this out. If we're going to have a world where we all belong, in a world that's worth living, a world that's not burning constantly, we have no choice but to figure it out. And we have to figure it out on multiple levels, both at a personal level, institutional level, and the power level. And I think if we pay attention to it, we can do that. So thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who joined us today for the first event of Uncommon Threats. We'll be here again at the end of July, and we hope you will join us for everything we will be doing at the Democracy and Belonging Forum. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.